Welcome everyone to the next event in this series, which is Zoning Learning from Abroad. This time we're in South Africa, which is a totally new context to me and I imagine to a lot of you here. And we've had we had over 100 people sign up. I don't know if we've got 100 people actually joining us now, but it's quite a few of you, so that's good. I'm Vicki Payne. I'm a planner and an urban designer working at URBED in Manchester, and I'm going to be your chair for the evening. And upstairs at the moment, I actually have what I think are some very bored and restless children. So if I seem distracted at any point, it's because I'm hearing banging and occasional screaming from above me. But yeah, I feel for them. So I will introduce our event partners once more. So we have the Academy of Urbanism Young Urbanists. They're a network of students and early career professionals who are passionate about developing their knowledge of good urbanism. We have the Urbanist Platform, which is an organisation fostering diversity and inclusion in the property, urban planning and architecture industries. And then we have POS Novus, who are part of the Planning Officers Society, and they represent a new generation of voices in public planning, and they're both a think tank and a network. So those are all great organisations, very active on Twitter, so go and follow them if you don't already. And so for our speakers tonight, we have Janine and Tristan joining us. And I understand that we might also have Manira, who is a municipal official from the city of Cape Town, who's going to join us for the Q&A and ask some questions. So Janine Harholt is an urban planner from Cape Town, completing a master's in Spatial Heritage at the Vrije University in Amsterdam at the moment. She serves on the Young Urbanist Steering Committee in Cape Town, so the South Africa contingent of the Academy of Urbanism. She's interested in cultural identity and everyday experiences of urban life, which is something I'm sure we all share. And her experiences in strategic spatial development frameworks, precinct planning, and heritage resource management. And then we have Tristan Sandwich, who studied town and regional planning. And he first worked in provincial land use administration and then at a private planning practice in Cape Town. So he spent most of a decade now working in the development industry in South Africa, Mauritius, and Nigeria. His projects have included private residential and commercial developments, public sector housing projects, and all the sort of research and market awareness that goes along with that. So we will be recording this event, and you can add questions and comments in the chat box as we go along. Feel free to do that as the presentation is going. Our speakers have said that if there's any terms or anything that you really don't understand, feel free to flag that in the chat box and one of us will kind of jump in and ask that question as they're presenting. Otherwise, just hold your questions until the end and I'll call you up during the Q&A to turn on your video and ask them. So I'll hand over to Janine and Tristan.
Thanks, Vicky. Thanks for the introduction. We are very excited for all the people joining us today. It's quite a turnout. So Olga will be sharing the presentation and myself and Tristan will just indicate to her when to switch slides.
Just bear with me.
So I'm just waiting for that.
Give me a second.
Okay.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Thank you.
I think you can go to the next slide already. Okay, so as Vicky mentioned, I am part of the Young Urbanists in Cape Town. We have a very similar mandate as the Young Urbanists in the UK, but our main priority is just to facilitate a platform for discussion about issues in our cities. And we are currently in a process of transition, but some of the faces here on the screen are part of our steering committee, and I've been serving on the board for a few years. Yeah, so I hope there's some of us representing the crew tonight. Myself, I've been working mostly in spatial and more strategic planning. And as Vicky kind of introduced, I think this is the reason why we've divided the presentation between myself and Tristan. Olga, you can go to the next slide. So for the first part, I will be doing more of a contextual discussion and just giving some background to the South African context. I think that's important to kick off the conversation. And then afterwards, Tristan will quickly take us through the more process and technical aspects of land use management and regulation in South Africa, or more actually in Cape Town. And I think the majority of tonight, we really want to focus on the discussion and have people ask questions and really just engage with the topic. So yeah, I can start with the next slide. So I think it's important, without turning it into a history lesson, just to refresh our realization of how young urban planning actually is in Africa. It really took a very drastic turn from pre-colonial to colonial times, and especially in Southern Africa. The picture you can see is kind of a representation of how the more indigenous people used to organize themselves spatially, and it usually was something that was very temporary, or even settling in caves, or something more organic and nature orientated. But then in around the 1600s, settlers started arriving in the Cape, and this changed quite a lot. So obviously over quite a long period of time. But at around 1880, when the Berlin Conference formalized colonialism in many parts of Africa and also in South Africa, the kind of formal urban form in towns wasn't really that common across the whole country. And what you can also see in the map is a map of Cape Town from the 1880s. It's not actually very widely expanded, but it was quite a different way of thinking about space and settlement, and in a more Western structured way. So what's interesting is in 1947, the British Town and Country Planning Act was passed. And this act, which I'm sure most of you know about, served as the modern foundation for town planning for British colonies, and it ended up making its way to South Africa as well. So Olga, if you go to the next slide. So obviously not having the opportunity to really go into too much detail on this topic, but just to highlight that at the same time, at around 1948, apartheid planning standards were developed. And these planning standards really dominated the South African land use management system for about 40 years. And I think the most important thing to say here is that zoning and land use, it was really part of the main structuring element of the apartheid city, dividing the city into racial areas. And over the town span of about 40 years, more than 1 million hectares of urban land was actually zoned according to this concept. And the divisions were usually created through very strategically located infrastructure like rail or big roadways. And eventually forced expropriation also took place. So this is really just to emphasize that land use and the regulation of land has always been a very sensitive subject in South Africa, especially now. And I think that the majority of planners in 1991, 1993, that time, I think was quite overwhelmed with the embeddedness that this zoning system created in the way that the South African city shaped itself over such a long period of time. And I think most planners here from South Africa can agree that we are still really grappling with this spatial outcome. So if you go to the next slide, what we have today is a very unequal city. Cape Town has grown to almost 5 million people, but segregation still continues, and low density peripheral subsidized housing schemes really emphasizes this. And zoning, even though the intentions are really, really positive with an amazing constitution and very well written spatial planning legislation for social justice and equity and integration, the actual tools like zoning and land use regulation are not yet really achieving those goals. The map is just showing how that racial segregation is still playing itself out spatially. So the next slide is just showing an image of what we are dealing with today, where we sit with higher end residential, very high property values, exactly right next door to extreme informality and lack of services. And the zoning between these two areas are vastly different. And in some cases, in the more informal areas, city officials actually don't zone these areas because as soon as you zone them, they have implications for infrastructure and it just gets very complex. So on the next slide, I think just to end off my part, oh, sorry, this slide first. What's interesting to talk about just from my side is the fact that, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've really been more into the spatial development, strategic, long-term planning process as a planner in South Africa. And on the left, you can see one of these projects developed for a smaller municipality in the Western Cape, where it's really about identifying longer term areas for growth and more principle-driven spatial planning concepts. And in theory, this process needs to inform the integrated zoning scheme, which is the more day-to-day application of land use regulation. And I know the legends are quite small, but on the right, you'll see how the more spatial long-term thinking translates into quite a lot of categories of zones, and each of them has different implications, which Tristan will talk to you about. So this relationship, I think, is something that is not that well facilitated at the moment. I, for myself, never really deal with land use processes. And I think a lot of land use planners don't really engage with the more strategic, longer term plans. And this is something that in the next slide, I just wanted to highlight already for us to start thinking about. And then in addition to that, also just this question around flexibility and if zoning can really accommodate these big changes and influxes of people and informality, and especially in a context like Cape Town, where this is the status quo. But then maybe also to think about how we can harness zoning differently to address issues of these kind of constantly changing environments. But I think we'll come back to these questions at the end. I just wanted to bring them up so long to kind of give some food for thought. But I'll now hand over to Tristan, who will talk us through the more processual steps in terms of land use regulation.
You can move to the next slide, Olga, please. I just wanted to take a quick opportunity to thank Janine and the Young Urbanists team from the UK for having me. And to say, like, leading up to this chat has been such a great way for me to step out of the day-to-day interrogation and interpretation side of my job in law and regulation, and look a little bit more holistically at urban planning and zoning tools that I have at my disposal as a consulting planner. Yeah, so it's been really cool. And thank you for allowing me that opportunity to gain that insight into all of this stuff. It's been really interesting. So let me jump straight in. I wanted to explain that zoning in Cape Town, and Janine's touched a bit on this as well, has been the work of many minds to constructive and in the past destructive ends over many years. But what began in the Cape as a series of locality-specific zoning maps and regulations, almost drawn on paper and colored in with crayons. Not to say that it was infantile, but that's how it was done in those days, which covered the combined Cape Peninsula. has now become an integrated spatial and regulation document that is a database and a regulatory system which we use to interrogate land use. And that really came into being around 1993 when the Cape Peninsula became a Cape metropolitan area. The regulatory zoning part of this has been quite long established and updated incrementally to become this massive spatial data set. And I was looking earlier at a GIS of the metro from July 2018, and every single of something like 804,500 properties at that stage have been assigned a regulatory zone. And that doesn't include what you're looking at on the screen now, which is a little bit more spatially aware, but every single owned land unit, be it public or private, is zoned and given a set of regulations which is attached to it, which is quite insane. In that sense, our base zoning, residential, commercial, industrial, it both classifies and regulates the land use, which is not dissimilar to your national land use database in the UK. But obviously it adds the second layer of not only defining what a landowner, what the land use of the site is, but also what a landowner can and can't do with their particular piece of land. You can move on to the next slide. So our zoning scheme, or our development management scheme, as we call it since 2015, separates land use zoning into obviously spatial categories where we're looking at a control and regulation level, and then some more wider spatial categories, which we call overlay zones, which incorporate certain things like heritage protection, local areas with specific zoning parameters like heights of buildings adjacent to scenic drives, additional floor space permitted on certain properties within CBDs, and even incentive zones where the city uses an overlay zone to give a tax incentive so that people will go and invest in those areas if there hasn't been investment, and things like parking zones closer to big public transport interchanges and things, so that people are incentivized to use public transport instead of to use their own private transport. In my next slide, I've dropped in just a small extract from our development management scheme to kind of highlight how complex it's become over the years, where we're looking at now one table of a multi-page document which just looks simply at a single residential zone, which is our conventional housing. That's a part of a residential slew of zonings that includes everything from this to incremental and low income housing to what we call general residential zones, which incorporate much higher density residential buildings, hotels and similar. And each one of those has their own set of regulations depending on where the property is located, how big the property is, and whatever the overlay type zonings have in terms of influence on them. So it's a complex zoning system, but as Janine touched on as well, is that when you've got such complexity and such minuscule kind of regulatory processes that go with every single property, you do have quite a difficult time affecting large-scale holistic change, especially when there are issues like we've established over the last 60 years in South Africa. On my next slide touches a little bit more on the city of Cape Town as a municipal area and how it's dealt with from the regulator or the administrator's point of view. And Munira, you'll have to afford me a bit of a errata here, because it's obviously from my perspective as a consultant rather than from somebody who works within the organization. So we have 8 planning districts, and that's specifically in Cape Town. Our neighboring municipalities have their own planning bylaws, their own sets of regulations, and although they are similar to our zoning scheme and our development management here in Cape Town, they are permitted to have their own way of doing things, for want of a better term. You can move on to the next one, please. What I was going to say is that as a province in the Western Cape, we have a set of commenting planners who sit at a provincial level as well, who oversee obviously provincial planning goals and imperatives, but allow the actual decision making to happen at a municipal level. So in the city of Cape Town, we're looking at obviously an executive director, a bunch of head management, and then within these 8 districts, district managers, planning section heads, as well as alternative department section heads, and then underneath those section heads will sit town planners and administration staff to assist. And that's at the town planner level is where Munira would fit into this organogram. So it's again, we've got a complex land use system, and then almost quite a complex organizational system at the city of Cape Town that one deals with at various levels, and different decisions are made at various levels. And that's where,
maybe just to add that this department is totally separate from the strategic spatial planning department, correct?
Absolutely correct. This is almost like a decision-making department from a single application base, as opposed to a strategic forward planning over a multiple year. Not that, yeah, anyway, the point is made, yeah. You can move on, please, Olga. As a final touch on the administrative side of what happens with this, I just wanted to give you guys a summary of the kind of decision-making process from a land use and land use change perspective. In summary, after a professional planner such as myself would make an application, there'd be a processing period, followed by a public participation period, and an interdepartmental circulation to engineers and spatial planners, environmental officers, heritage officers, and then an assimilation of all of that information and data into a final assessment and a recommendation from a town planner within the city. Then a decision is made on an application and communicated to the applicant at the time. And then once that decision has been made, an appeal is offered to anybody in the public, in fact, these days, to appeal that decision for whatever reason. Once an appeal opportunity has been either ignored or an appeal process has been finalized, then a final decision on that particular land use application can be granted by the City of Cape Town, with the premise that it has to be acted on within a specific time period. So these timeframes for these various components are in fact completely regulated as well and written down into our own land use planning bylaw. And I've left this kind of almost project management Gantt down on this slide that people can interrogate themselves. And I can also provide copies of that bylaw should you wish to have some late night reading. But these timeframes are an interesting thing, because if one had to go by them by the book, an application would take anything between 3 and 7 months to complete. although Munira will confirm for me that nothing generally goes to plan, and that an average land use application these days takes between sort of 6 and 12 months to come to an outcome, and that's excluding the administration of an appeal period. So there's a challenge there, both for a consultant like myself and the administrator, because for developers, every bit of time that is saved is always profit saved. So yeah, I hope I've given you a bit of an oversight over what goes on in the Cape planning field, and I'll hand back over to Janine to carry on.
Yeah, so the next slide is just a quote actually from a paper that was written by Vera Nel, who I see is in our session tonight. So we are very honored to have you here, Vera. She's written a lot about this exact topic in terms of, is zoning appropriate in South Africa and how can we improve it? What are the options for improving it? And what are the things we need to better understand? And this quote I find really sums it up quite well, because it says that one of the advantages of land use zoning is its simplicity and ease of application, but land use zoning simplifies and reduces the complexity of the built environment as well. So it almost reduces it to a set of rules and restrictions for a few categories of activities and land uses within an inflexible framework. So I think for myself, that is the thing that really, in a way, needs to change and is something that's quite important for the UK to consider. How do you create something that's regulated but flexible at the same time? It's very, very difficult. On the last slide, we've just listed a few of the key questions. I know it's quite text heavy, but it's just to leave it there for almost reference, because it kind of just highlights all the things that we've been grappling with, myself and Tristan, as we prepared this presentation. And it kind of summarizes just what we've been saying. But a lot of it is about flexibility and process and the relationship between long-term planning and day-to-day regulation. But I think something that's also interesting here is the presumption that almost comes from regulators to refuse rather than approve. This is not, obviously simplifying the statement, but it is a general thing that kind of happens with these kinds of processes. And the progress almost then takes a backseat. And I think I saw one of the questions was exactly about this topic, but I think that's also something to really think about, is this over-regulation actually leading us to any form of real progress and positive change and sustainable city making? That's something that me and Tristan have really been grappling with, and I think it will be quite a nice way to kick off the conversation. But yeah, thanks everyone, and I think we can now go to the discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think it's probably, of all these sessions, it's the one that I knew least about going in, so it's been really interesting to hear about it. I'm going to take my chair's prerogative and ask the question that I had first before I start going to people, which was that you talked about how the zonal system kind of reinforces those patterns of inequality, and I think it's a very visible version of something that we see in planning a lot. That is not necessarily unique to this context, but it's a very obvious example of it. And I wondered, when you were talking about the strategic spatial development process, whether addressing that inequality comes into those discussions very much, because it's something that is starting to be talked about, I think, a lot more here, at least by people who are active in the community, maybe less so, I don't know, in sort of policy development, but I wondered how much that factors in.
Yeah. No, I just quickly want to say that in the strategic planning realm, we have to frame everything within the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, which very much highlights spatial equity and social justice. And we really try and grapple with, you know, what can we do as spatial planners to rectify this kind of inaccessible pattern, and to create better equality and better access to opportunities. But it usually ends up becoming quite a theoretical discussion and or very conceptual, and that's part of that whole discussion about the relationship between the zoning scheme and those concepts, and that should be strengthened in a way.
From an application and administration point of view, it becomes even more challenging because one looks at a property in complete isolation. And while we have to answer these questions of law to say yes or no, we comply or don't comply with the requirements of the sort of spatial planning goals and initiatives of the municipality, it's very difficult to do that in the isolation of a single land parcel.
Yeah.
You know, so really where that gets established would definitely be in those spatial planning departments of the municipality, rather than from our point of view. It's very easy for me to say that I'll create jobs by developing a piece of land for a big industrial estate, but you know, once that thing is done, I move on to the next one.
Yeah, you're not seeing the cumulative impact of like every single decision that you're making building up. Yeah.
However, having said that, we do have to motivate why we are compliant, because otherwise there's an omission from our application in terms of law.
Okay, so I will stop hogging the questions and go to the chat. So Virna, you had something about areas that aren't clearly defined, so informal settlements and tribal areas. Do you want to turn your video on and ask that? I think you might have added some more, so feel free to sort of bunch your questions together if you have a few.
Hear me?
Yes.
I may have pronounced your name very poorly.
That it assumes a clearly defined registered piece of land to which one you can apply a zoning. But an informal settlement has no clearly defined properties in it. And areas under traditional authority, which you don't get in the Western Cape, but you get in other parts of South Africa, also don't have clearly defined and registered boundaries. How does one apply a system of zoning or land use management in such circumstances? I just want to throw it out as an issue that in South Africa we're grappling with.
Could I just add for a clarification for the sort of UK context, could you maybe provide in your answers a bit of an explanation about what an informal settlement means in a South African context?
Verna, I don't know if you want to answer that, but it basically means an area that is occupied. Initially, it's occupied illegally because it's occupied by people who don't own the land or who's not allowed, as per the zoning, to occupy the land. So it would be occupation through setting up informal settlements or informal houses. And then based on time, it almost becomes formal in a way because, you know, more people come and it grows. And it's kind of like, it's a very difficult thing to explain, but it is a place of growth and change and fluctuation. And it's difficult to manage because it's constantly changing. And it's exactly like Vera says, it doesn't have these cadastral boundaries. And as it expands, it kind of expands into different properties. So
they also generally aren't serviced, or
yes.
if they are, then they're very meagerly serviced.
but it's very important areas because it houses a very big portion of the population, and it's usually in locations where people really want to be because it's strategic and it's close to work opportunities. And if there's big open pieces of land in very strategic places that are not being used, people don't know what it's zoned for, who owns it. So, you know, it's almost inevitable that it will be occupied.
Yeah,
So,
so I was thinking when the question was asked, I was thinking, oh, maybe this is a kind of maybe a small proportion of the types of development, but it's quite a common feature, isn't it?
It's very common, yeah. And I think that's why Verna's question is important, because it's trying to use a formal system of cadastrally based land use regulation where a very big majority of the city functions in an informal manner. And I think it could be interesting to learn from other African examples, almost in that sense. But I don't have the answer. If anyone in the audience has a better answer than me, feel free.
It was a really interesting thing that you and I were chatting about earlier, Janine, where as a part of the sort of combination of those locality specific zoning schemes that I spoke about earlier, when the metropolitan was established, that a lot of the existing informal areas were cadastrally defined and given a zoning of what they called then undetermined, which basically wasn't a zoning. It was a color that they could color it in, but it had absolutely no regulation or rights associated to it whatsoever. And that continues into 2021. We just call it limited use now. So if there's a limited use zone around that, then gets redeveloped. Not to say that all limited use zones are informal settlements, but a lot of them are. Then rights can be associated with them going forward. But obviously that requires a lot of investment. And
I think, Charlotte, you had a comment in the chat about the sort of inflexibility of this system compared to the UK system. Did you want to come in and just make some comment about that?
Yeah, I find it really, really interesting. And we spoke about this when we were thinking about this event before, Janine, that you're looking for a more flexible system. And it's almost like the opposite is happening here. We're looking for a more certain system. And just to unpick that a bit, why do you want a more flexible system in a bit more detail would be really interesting. You know, does the community want a more flexible system? Like, do the communities in South Africa or Cape Town want a more flexible planning system, or are they happy with the sort of rigidity and rules-based system? Because I think one of the things we've got here is that communities don't like the inflexibility and the uncertainty of what can come out of planning decisions in England, specifically, probably more than the rest of the UK. So that would just, any comment on that would be really interesting.
I think it would be an interesting survey in Cape Town, but I think the security that comes with the kind of land parcel by parcel land use kind of identification helps, because when you buy a property, you know exactly what you can do with it. I think the frustration comes from timeframes, and if you want to change anything, it takes years and months, and it's very expensive. So it's those two things. It's like giving security within flexibility. That might be the ultimate goal, but it's very, yeah, I'm not sure how to achieve that. I see Muhammad has his hand up.
Oh yeah. Mohammed, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Hello?
Hello,
Hi.
we can hear you. Oh,
Okay.
Okay, so I've got a few questions actually, but I'll try to limit my questions. With regards to enforcement of the SPLUMA provisions, basically SPLUMA deals with both spatial planning and land use, obviously. But how ardently are these enforced? I'm asking this in the context of vertical consolidation of informal settlements. So for the UK-based people, what we see in other countries around the world is that, think of the favelas in Brazil or informal settlements in Asia or whatnot. People build up informal settlements themselves. But in South Africa, there's none of this sort of vertical consolidation. It's characterized by horizontal sprawl. So I'd just like to ask, this rigid based zoning system based on Charlotte's comment, I mean, how does the enforcement of this actually play in with regards to that there? If you look at a South African township, it's characterized by car usage. There's no vertical consolidation. And secondly, with regards to the PT1 and PT2 zones that Tristan actually had up on his thing, I'd like to ask a question with regards to minimum parking requirements. So what is the general trend in South Africa towards a sort of maximum parking requirement or a different sort of parking regulation that we do see in the UK and other countries, as opposed to just abolishing minimum parkings or having quite a stringent requirement for those? Thank you.
Tristan, do you maybe want to comment on the parking?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mohammed. From a parking regulation point of view, of course, as I've said, we've got a complex and like microscopically regulated zoning scheme, right? So when one submits an application, one has to check the box of saying, yay, nay, we've provided the correct amount of parking, be that in terms of a minimum requirement, or in fact, especially with the PT1 and PT2, if I can elaborate a little bit on that, they're actually maximum parking requirements. So the public transport zones, of which there are in fact 3, a PT standard, which then relates straight back to the normal zoning scheme parking requirements, a PT1, which is slightly dropped, and then a PT2, which in fact says that the city shouldn't even entertain any parking in a development in one of those zones at all. But as well as those standards, the city also puts forward they have a big push to transit-oriented development at the moment as well. So we have to really motivate and think about where development is going in terms of transport and availability of transport to the people who will eventually occupy those areas. I'm not sure if I've answered the question completely, but
yeah, I think it's just the fact that certain provisions get given in certain areas, but people always find loopholes.
right.
And the more complex, the more loopholes you can find. So that's...
Yeah, so I think maybe the takeaway is that yes, there are other policies in play that kind of establish different transport and parking related measures similar to what's happening in the UK, where they have like zones, but not at a regulatory level. At a regulatory level, you've still got to say, this is what's required of me, this is what I'm providing, either comply or depart from it.
I see Cleo wants to add to the parking zone discussion.
Thanks. Sorry, I don't know how to put up a hand.
That's fine.
Yeah, so I've worked for the municipality too, and I just thought I'd add that I find PT zones, I think there is a difficulty in enforcing them in a sense, because they actually are quite flexible in that they give a minimum requirement, and that if somebody comes close to that minimum requirement, that's great, but it's very difficult to, or there is no way to enforce people to drop their parking. So even if they could be in an area which is a PT2 area, which they could provide no parking at all, and it would be legal. If they choose to provide a huge amount of parking, there isn't in the bylaw, there isn't in the DMS something that says, no, you have to reduce it. So it's left up to the individual kind of planner to argue that point, which could maybe be it's maybe a shortcoming.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think it also relates to this question that Muhammad added in the chat about the principles that the Planning Act tries to encourage. And the Act is guiding strategic planning as well as land use planning. And those principles that are usually kind of embedded in the spatial development frameworks, which guide the long-term planning, I think are more strongly reflected in those documents because you can identify restructuring areas, you can identify new growth areas, you can identify new core areas, and in that you can also identify public transport priorities. And I think the problem is then when you try and bring those concepts into the land use management, then people come up with these PT zones, which in principle is trying to encourage that and the accessibility and encouraging public transport development, but it doesn't get enforced like completely. I don't know how to say it, but exactly like Cleo just said, it becomes an idea, but it's not bold enough to actually create the actual change that is needed.
I'm going to go to Morietta Stewart, who had a question that touched on a slide that I found really interesting of Tristan's, which was all the different overlays. Morietta, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. I won't put my video on because I'm literally in bed.
Okay. No worries. Good place to be.
So I am a student and a city official working in heritage, and I've been tasked with the heritage overlay zone and to get that in place for a number of areas in the city, and finding it extremely challenging to administer or to get to be an effective tool for heritage management, because it also works together with another system of laws, which is the Heritage Resources Act, which is not a city administered act. But I'm really interested to hear other experiences elsewhere in the world of how heritage within the built environment especially is dealt with. Is overlay zoning something that works elsewhere, because it's extremely complex in Cape Town. It hasn't really been effectively used for the different themes that it's meant to kind of protect or enhance, like heritage or environment, or actually any overlay can be created for a particular theme. For example, an affordable and inclusionary housing overlay zone is currently being investigated, and many other overlays can be created, but they all become competing logics in the same space. So an inclusion overlay and a heritage overlay and the base zoning in a place like Woodstock and Salt River is extremely, extremely complex to deal with. And like which theme and which logic wins in the end, because you can't actually, can't deal with all of those in one place.
Yeah, I was interested to read your question because I looked at that slide and thought, oh God, like that's brilliant. That makes so much sense. Like you have your base zone and then you have this overlay and then you have like these special areas that makes it. I was like, that's a perfect system. Like maybe we could have something like that. Yeah. But as you're saying, it's like very.
I mean, like, it's very hard to deal with. For example, in a place like Woodstock and Salt River, it's an easy example to use, but got historic fabric, and you've got a generational rooted living heritage in that space. you've got extreme gentrification taking place, you've got the market forces for micro apartments, and you want inclusionary housing all in one place.
Yeah.
So for me, it's impossible. It really is. So
Can I throw? There's another twist to this, because as a town planner, as a town planner submitting applications, I have my own experience in dealing with all of that. But I wanted to throw that to Munira, and maybe she can share a little bit of her experiences, because interestingly, she is the one at the end of the day who has to assess an application that is submitted for land use change, and actually go through all of these layers and sandwiches of and, as you say, bureaucratic tangled webs to get down to actually making some sort of rational decision about it.
Yeah, Munira, that'd be great.
I'm so sorry, my internet. Sorry, my internet has just been going crazy. I don't think I heard everything. What would you like me to elaborate on?
No, I was just saying that Marieta's sort of said that our zoning provides so much information, but at the same time, you as a town planner taking on an application for zoning change or development, you have to go through all of these layers. So I just wanted to hear your experience of going through all of that, and how, or what the challenges and opportunities there are there.
Okay, so what I can say is that sometimes the quality of the submission is not always great. So you obviously need to try to help people as much as you can. Looking at Tristan, I don't mean you specifically. It's just that in general, like sometimes you don't always have a planner submitting an application. So the quality that gets submitted is obviously not that great. I mean, like you said, we need to sift through all of that and go through the process of checking the submission requirements. Is it up to scratch? If not, then it needs to go through a process of the additional information stage where you check in the bylaw and the development management scheme, which is basically the zoning scheme, what is required, what has been submitted, what's missing, and then that's how you take it from there, basically. So sometimes the process is quite, it can be like quick and easy depending, and then other times it's difficult to deal with people, especially if they don't understand. So like I said, it's not always a planner that is submitting the applications. So that can be a bit challenging at times, like to deal with certain applications.
That's an interesting thing that you said, that in South Africa, there's no requirement, or at least in the Cape, there's no requirement that a professional planner submits an application.
Yes.
Anybody can submit an application. The requirement is rather on the other side in law, that a professional planner needs to make the decision on the application. So then Munira has to, as she says, sift through all of the various information just to get to the point where she says she's got enough information to make that decision.
This kind of touches on a question that Julie had about resourcing. Julie, I don't know if you want to ask, and it might be that all three of you have a comment on this.
Yes, I just had a quick question again, like just to recontextualize with the UK context. I think there's kind of a chronic underfunding of planning departments here, and there's a bit of an assumption that once we move towards a zoning, like a zonal system, applications would just be like, you know, a lot less time consuming, and therefore planning departments would like shrink even further. And I have a feeling actually that's quite a misguided assumption, because zoning seems to be very resource intensive. So I was wondering, for instance, for a city like Cape Town, how many people work in the zonal like zoning department, like just for land use zoning, say?
Okay, so in my specific department, we are about 11 town planners. So my team is made up of 11 planners, and then I have my section head and then the district manager. So we are apparently one of the bigger offices that has more planners than the rest of the districts. But yeah, so my team is basically made up of 11 town planners, but we also have land use plans examiners. So they basically deal with the building plans and they assess it in terms of the land use requirements. They also form part of my team. So they are 4. So we about 15 altogether in my team.
And that times how many districts there are?
We 8 districts, yeah.
Do either of you want to comment
And
further
is it
on that?
differentiation between land use planners and building development officers as well? So the people who actually then look at the national building regulations to say that you've built your structure correctly. That's a whole separate department.
Yeah.
And that is supplemented by a customer interface department who is public facing as well as administrative. So there's a fair few people per district.
But just to add, and I think that relates to Marietta's point, is that it ends up becoming quite a tick box exercise in a way. It's like you need to prove that you have this and this and this and this and this, and then the discussion around like, is it strategic, is it relevant, is it important, is it relating to the culture and the heritage of that area? It only almost comes at the end. And then it's almost like, okay, let's just get it through and go on with the process. Obviously, it depends on the scale of the application, but I think that's something that sometimes gets lost in the technocratic filling in an application process.
Yeah. Just taking a step back from the sort of decision-making part of the process to more of the strategic side, we had a question from Kathy Pollard about climate change. Kathy, do you want to ask that?
Hi, yeah, thanks. That was really interesting. I guess just to give you a bit of context to my question, in Scotland, we've got a new land use strategy being proposed, which should sit alongside our national planning framework. And I was just wondering looking at how we locate development and where we locate development, obviously depends on long-term land use issues relating to climate change, for example. So what do you think is the best way to communicate some of the larger spatial issues that we need to deal with as planners in relation to some of the local, zonal plans that you're developing, for example? So that relationship between local development planning and sort of the larger issues. And I just think that discussion is really relevant to us. How do we communicate that, and how do we work across different departments? So I hope that makes sense, and yeah, really keen to hear what you think.
It's quite difficult because I'm not actually in the whole Cape Town scene in terms of planning, but I know that the city of Cape Town has a climate change strategy, and but as you say, I don't think it has really played itself out across departments. It's not really an umbrella policy. And in the end, when it comes to land use, we have a process called an environmental impact assessment, which is also like quite a time-consuming process, but that's almost like at the moment the only real form of link to climate change in this system. I think it's something that needs to be addressed through legislation and through policy. And our Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act talks about environmental sustainability, but it definitely still needs to be unpacked in terms of how it plays itself out in practice and in reality and in how we plan our cities. It's quite a big challenge, I think.
Can I add to that quickly?
Yes.
That's Marietta. So at the moment, the city is going through its 5-year review of all its district plans, spatial development frameworks for the different districts. And it's at that level where there's a metropolitan office that has these so-called experts in these different fields that sits at Metro office, but they aren't. That expertise hasn't devolved down to a district level. So it's kind of a feeding down of information, trying to affect climate change in these district planning processes and at a large metro scale, and coming down to the micro application, like a property application doesn't really happen unless the input is requested. The only way to affect that, and Munira can help, is to actually bring those things down into the bylaw somehow, in how applications are assessed, and if it becomes a legal requirement for certain developments to have certain kind of green architecture or all those kinds of things. With things like subdivisions and town planning layouts, those kinds of stuff, I think there's more impact we can have in terms of softer spaces and kind of green architecture. But when it comes to singular land use applications for sites, it's very hard. It doesn't come down to that level. So it's difficult.
Can I just add on to that, please, onto Kathy's question, if possible?
Sure.
Okay, so I think Kathy spoke about large-scale land use issues. And I think this necessitates a discussion on the constitutional architecture of South Africa. So there's three basic spheres of government. Obviously, you've got your national, provincial, and local, but it's not hierarchical. They're interrelated, but interdependent as well. So they each have like the sort of competency with regards to planning and land use as well, although it's supposed to be at the lowest level, at local government level. So sometimes there is this conflict between national government wanting to implement a quick fix solution, and then which obviously goes against the legislation and the spatial planning of the local government. And we see this, I think a concrete example of this is the recent Pretoria East development that's led from national government. And that's an absolutely sort of terrible sort of land use, but it's being pushed because it's a sort of catalytic project from national government. Thanks.
I wonder if it might be worth Peter Mansbridge kind of adding his question to this, because he was asking about how much the public are involved in these kind of processes. Which sort of goes to that like top down versus bottom up kind of discussion.
Yeah, I was just interested, I mean, it's quite a general question, but just interested in your sort of perceptions from the speakers about, well, personally, what extent and when does it take place, engagement with the public and consultation? Is it like when a local plan is reviewed, are the public involved, and also are the public consulted on every sort of development proposal? And then, you know, what sort of engagement and interest is there from the public? What sort of apathy, or is there an apathy from the public to an extent about effectiveness of the planning system? And also, you know, different groups and within society are some more engaged with the planning system than others. Thanks.
Yeah, I was thinking, so Mohammed mentioned a scheme that was particularly inappropriate or that people didn't like, and obviously in the UK our expectation would be that like some community group would get together and oppose it, and you know there'd be that sort of back and forth. Like, is that a component of the system there?
I think as the first part, the local plans, like the spatial development frameworks, they need to go through a 90-day or a 60-day public commenting period, but these are usually it's not very engaging. It's kind of just sharing the document and leaving it at public libraries and halls and things like that. You usually don't get very good impact or input. I really think that process needs to be improved. But I think when it comes to land use applications, certain scales of applications, Tristan, you must correct me if I'm wrong, kind of trigger public engagement, but most of the time it doesn't. But there's a very strong community in Cape Town around opposing developments, and usually it's quite heritage driven. So it would be like a neighborhood development group or a representation body that opposes the development, and it kind of delays the process. So that it's a very active communities, especially in Cape Town, if I can comment on that. Tristan, I don't know if you want to add.
Munira can help as well, but it's the other way around. It's assumed that any application will be advertised publicly. One would have to motivate the counter, which is to say that either what you've done is the legwork beforehand to go and speak to the respective neighbors, if it's of a small enough scale to say that only they will be impacted, and then submit that to the City of Cape Town saying, look, we've done it already. Or alternatively, the level of the application doesn't require, because the land use rights are already in place, for example, to say that one doesn't need to advertise. But the assumption is definitely, and the legal assumption is definitely, that any application submitted to the City of Cape Town will go through at least a 30-day public participation process of varied scales.
And do you have, in the UK, that was something that was introduced called neighbourhood planning, which allows groups of people on quite a small local level to come together and develop policy for their local area, and that has to sit underneath the sort of the wider policies. Do you have anything equivalent to that?
Similar, but it's more like public organizations, civic group type people who may be chaired by a political ward councillor or something like that, but they're certainly people who would comment rather than have much to say in the actual policy derivation.
Yeah, and I think we also have a municipal planning tribunal that is supposed to be quite representative. We have ward councillors who are more representing the actual communities that they're from. It's quite a broad network of people who are all kind of having a say in the process. And I think what Morietta is saying in the chat is important, that sometimes it's very, very useful and it doesn't get the voice that it deserves. And I think in Cape Town especially, there's always this tension between trying to accommodate the developers, but then also trying to accommodate the public. And sometimes I feel like these decisions aren't really bold enough towards the public good. And I think as the young urbanist, we sometimes try and be a little bit more provocative to have an opinion about what's happening. You know, a lot of it is being made by people who won't necessarily be around in 50 years, and it has implications on our lives. So I'm quite passionate about that.
Yeah, Morietta, do you want to comment on that? Because not everyone's going to necessarily be looking at the chat. So did you want to come in quickly on the Woodstock area that you were talking about?
Oh yeah. So I mean, I speak about Woodstock a lot because there's a very strong civic and social activism in the area. I don't know if a lot of you will know Indifferent Ukwazi, who are housing activists, and they've been very active in the Woodstock area with other residents groups there, and they representatives from the organization have been provoking a lot of issues around ground up residents taking charge of dreaming and envisioning a spatial future for their neighborhoods. So they've been engaging very strongly with our spatial planners at the city, and have undergone quite a long process of Saturday workshops and evening chats and hand-drawn visioning processes and all those kinds of things. And it's all kind of fed in really well into the now formal advertising process for the district. So it kind of it was a precursor to the formal advertising. It's like what Janine said, the formal advertising period is actually quite prescriptive. It's only 60 days. You have to do a written submission. It has to be it's quite prescriptive of how that is done. But there is some creativity around how that participation is starting to kind of emerge. And there's another organization called DAG, and they're also quite a strong activist movement in planning and spatial justice, and they've been very active in mobilizing civil society in taking charge of their own neighborhoods and planning with the city for their own neighborhood. So yeah, I think in that respect, I think there's a positive move towards more participative spatial planning. Very different as land use management. It's different for land use management.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like the issue that Janine highlighted of the spatial planning not being particularly engaging to the general population, but having a big impact on decisions, and then like as it comes down to it being translated to a smaller scale and it's affecting people in their local area, there's a lot more engagement, a lot more interest. Like that's definitely something we see in the UK. I keep saying that there is some guidelines that have come out recently on community-led local area plans. I don't know, Claire, if you want to comment on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure what status it's at, but there have been guidelines drafted so that if the community does want to do their own local area plan or local area spatial framework, there's guidelines on what they need to include in it, sort of what sort of issues they need to consider and base information, and then the process to follow to take it to the end. And then ultimately that would go through a council approval process, just like a local area plan, which was drafted by the council itself. And so I think there's quite a strong tie that the community would need to work with the planner for that district to make sure that they are on track sort of the whole way through. I don't have the guidelines right on hand with me, but I can look and send them to Janine.
Cool.
Awesome.
No, that sounds really interesting. I wondered actually, do any of you, because this might be a relatable experience for anyone who's ever done a public consultation in the UK, but do any of you have any particularly standout positive or negative experiences of doing consultation events? I don't know if either of you have.
Well, I remember people fighting with each other.
Physically fighting.
Physically attacking each other.
Standard.
It was not necessarily a positive experience, but it was memorable. And it was probably about a topic that was not relevant to the discussion. No, but I think I've seen cases where, you know, you actually have a more physical way of interacting with a plan. So you will have a model and people can really see how it will change their neighborhood. And it's really nice then when you see, oh, wow, I can actually visualize the changes and comment on it. And I actually saw, you know, a lady who usually sells, you know, food next to the road talking to a very high up city official about her opinion about this proposal. So yeah, I've been in situations where the hierarchy gets kind of scrapped almost, and then that's actually when the really interesting conversations come out.
Yeah, that my interaction with a sort of public meeting happened fairly recently with a large incremental housing project that we've been involved with. That is it's public-private JV funded, and there the real challenge was everybody's invited to come to a meeting, but their status quo is complete informality. A large majority sitting on a public housing list, waiting to be provided with a dwelling. Some of them for a decade. So I use the word status quo, but their minds aren't in finding out where the zones are going to be or where the roads are going to be. They're just saying, hey guys, look, our roofs are still leaking. Our children are in the streets and that's where they are. So that was a really like eye-opening public meeting to have.
Yeah, I think that that interaction of people is definitely fascinating, and like that sort of scenario that you were talking about, Janine, like, yeah, somebody being able to talk very directly to like an elected representative or someone who wields a lot of power is like really fascinating. I kind of miss that aspect, you know, doing a lot of consultation online now. Like, I don't think you necessarily see that as much. I don't know if like, what's your sort of experience been of your professional roles changing like post-COVID?
Well, I'm actually able to still work in South Africa while being in the Netherlands. So professionally, that's been a big plus. I can attend meetings in towns which I'm not in. But Tristan, this might be something more for you to answer, because I know, you know, there was a period where everything shut down. And I know Manera actually told us the other day that a big benefit has been for the city officials to all work from home, and the efficiency has increased because people are, you know, not necessarily distracted by driving to the offices. But it's also, you know, creating technical issues. You can't go into the archives or visit your boss in his office quickly to ask a question. I think from the official side, yeah, it has ups and downs. But Tristan, I'm not sure how it's affecting you.
I'm in a similar situation as you. As you know, we have a decentralized planning firm, so it's been much the same. Yeah, I think it really would have affected people who were used to going in and getting some guidance from somebody with a bit more experience. Thankfully, I've got my director, who's I see in the audience at a moment's phone call away, you know. So I'm blessed in that sense. But yeah, from our chat with Manera the other day, it does sound like there's certainly challenges, but also some opportunities to have a little bit more of a flexible day, where one can take a little bit longer break if one needs to.
Yeah. But I think in terms of participation and engagement of local communities, it's quite a struggling situation, because I know, like, for example, where I am in the Netherlands, it's a totally different situation because people just have access to internet and data, and they can now just comment on a document digitally. But in South Africa, you still, you know, you really have to physically go to communities and talk to them about your proposals, and that I'm not sure is able to happen at the moment. So it's really, I think, difficult.
Yeah, I actually had a question about the sort of digital stuff, and we're coming towards the end of the session now, and there's been quite a lot of sort of internal discussions within the chat, and I hope I've picked up everyone's questions. But as I'm asking this and our panelists are answering, if you have a question that you really want to ask before the end, or if you have a question that I've somehow missed in the chat, if you add it now and I'll see it, and then I'll pick it up right at the end. But my question was kind of about, Tristan talked about how in the 90s that you had really updated your systems in terms of planning, and you had what sounds like really quite a good unified GIS system where all of your plan documents are integrated. And my experience of a UK context is that like plan tech stuff is really not coming through very consistently. And I wondered if you had an insight into whether that is common in a South African context. Is that fairly unique to Cape Town? Or you may not know this, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
In the Western Cape in which we work, and that's our context because that's where our law applies. The various provinces in Cape Town have their own planning laws and guidelines that control them. Here, our planning offices have GIS officials, and they are linked directly through to our Surveyor General's office. So once a zone is changed or a zone is allocated, and that cadastral is given, or say a piece of agricultural land is subdivided and changed into a residential estate or a residential development, that spatial data is recorded digitally and then provided not only to the city to update their spatial data, but also to our Surveyor General through SG diagrams. So that's how we deal with it here. So it's like a constant turnover, and it's been like that for forever.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that sounds like pretty efficient. Does it tend to work well, like, or is there sort of breakdowns in communication? You're like, yeah, of course it works well.
There's both breakdowns in communication. No, I was really interested, and I was trying to find out how many properties were in the Cape Peninsula earlier. And then I was trying to draw some comparisons to the UK context, and I found this National Land Use Database. And I was really interested to see how that had been formulated and how long it had been going for, because that is an incredibly detailed document, to the point where they're saying different types of woodland and different surfaces on single properties. You know, that sort of level of data is insane.
My perception is that that's like, we have really good data. It's like how well that then feeds through into the planning legislation and stuff. Because, for example, in the UK, if you were to go to a local planning authority and you wanted to see some of their spatial planning policies, you might find yourself having to download a PDF document and looking at like page after page of maps.
Yeah.
Well,
it's pretty much, for us, it's pretty much available online in an interactive spatial system, and that happens at a provincial level, as well as specifically at a metropolitan level as well. So some of those images that Janine pulled into our presentation are straight out of that interactive data system.
That's impressive. So I don't think we had a question for UK-based planners from Mohammed, and anyone is welcome to jump in and answer this if you want. And then I was going to finish off with some clarification of terms, if you don't mind, that I'd picked up from the chat. Mohammed, do you want to put your call out there to the UK planners? And I'll see if anyone wants to answer it.
No, I'll wait for a volunteer.
In case anyone wants, so Mohammed's question was asking, like, how deep does the siloization of planning go in the UK? So I don't know if any UK planners would like to give their view on that.
We need Charlotte.
Yeah, Charlotte.
I
think Charlotte's had to go. Okay, if you don't mind, I was going to ask so I've seen a few phrases.
Well, just before you go,
no, go on.
Mohammed, I think the fact that no one's answers your question.
Yeah. That's a good point. I would say I haven't worked in public practice, so I feel like ill-equipped to comment on it, but I would say it has previously been very siloed and is now getting better. So there's an organization called Public Practice who place people in public sector, mainly like planning and development roles. And a lot of their placements seem to focus on dropping somebody in who can move between lots of different departments and actually join together some of the knowledge and thinking that exists. And I don't know how well that works, but
if I can just like jump in, like I'd say the main problem for me, like I work in local government, so I work in the public sector in London. I think that the main problem of relating to planning in the UK is really like underfunding, and yes, it is siloed. It is quite disconnected to many other forces, I guess, of that come play in the built environment. But for me, it comes down to funding, and I think that planning has been kind of blamed for all the problems relating to the housing crisis. And for instance, like because the housing crisis is like the big thing that everyone is obsessed about in the UK. And I think the planning system has been seen as bearing the brunt of it and being responsible for it. Which I don't think is a fair judgment.
And the context to that, I guess, is that like public sector resources have been cut over successive years. And obviously, if you're making decisions about delivering frontline services and making cuts to something like planning departments, I think they've suffered a lot from that.
Yeah, and I mean the housing crisis, which is like the main thing really, but you know, the current government has made planning here all about solving this housing crisis, has also its root in the privatization of social housing, which has been driving up the prices in part of properties. So it's, yeah, but planning is seen as you know, the one to blame.
Yeah.
That was my rant.
No, it's good. As a finishing off statement, did you guys want to comment on that at all? Like, is the sort of, do you think the planning system in your experience has been well funded? Like, is it seen as something beneficial generally, or does it get that sort of blame and targeting that Julie was talking about?
From my side, my personal feeling about it is well funded, but it could obviously be better funded. But the blame often goes to planning, but without trying to step on anyone's toes, the blame should actually sometimes rather end up with political decisions being made, because planning decisions really, most of the time, have very good intentions. But, you know, we also have a housing crisis, but it's more of an affordable housing crisis and having it in strategic locations. And the plans are there, the concepts are there, but it's a political decision that just doesn't want to go through. And yeah, I think that's sometimes something that we have to carry on our shoulders as planners quite often.
Yeah, it sort of seems like they continue to kick the tin down the road in that sense.
Ending on a low note potentially, but yeah, I definitely like I recognize that idea that, you know, planning is the visible end of like a lot of political decision making, and maybe gets unfairly targeted for that reason. Okay, well, I think then, unless anyone would like to add anything else, that we will finish off. Like, just wanted to thank all of you for taking part, and for our speakers and everyone's who's contributed. Tristan, I think, like you said, that it's been really nice, like preparing for this, and I've definitely found with these sessions that it's a really nice break and an opportunity to be reflective. So I'm sure everyone shares that. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining.
I agree with Mohammed. I think we have to actually have another session.
Yeah.
Only discussion.
Yeah. I'm sure between us we can figure it all out.
Yeah, thanks for everyone's inputs, and yeah, it was really, really such a nice discussion. Sorry, Vicky, I interrupted you with your clarifications.
Oh no,
you can email me about it or something.
Yeah, it was the Splumer thing that everyone keeps talking about. I was like, what is that? It's an acronym, but I don't know what it stands for.
It's such a long thing that no one wants to say it, but it's the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act.
Okay, well I can sleep happy now. Like,
okay, great.
All right, thanks very much,
Vicky.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.